Homeschooling is freer in America than it has ever been, and yet a handful of states still retain antiquated laws that were written back in the dark ages of the 1980s and 1990s. But most states have removed unnecessary legal barriers with the recognition that homeschooling works. But pendulums swing. And in America today, the pendulum frequently swings in the wrong direction. And opponents of homeschool freedom are working in new and more coordinated ways to make homeschooling harder and less accessible to parents. Legislative action to roll back homeschool freedom is being considered in Illinois, Michigan, and West Virginia, in part because of negative portrayals of homeschooling in the press. My guest today is Jim Mason. He is the president of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of homeschooling and the role that the Homeschool Legal Defense Association has been playing for over 40 years in securing and maintaining homeschool freedom. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. This is the Heidi St. John podcast. Stick around. I think you're going to be encouraged. Thank you guys for tuning in today. I'm so glad that you're listening to the show, and we appreciate very much that you're leaving reviews for the show wherever podcast reviews are available for people to read. I want to say that as we talk about homeschooling here at the show, you guys know I am a huge proponent of home education, and I continue to maintain that I think homeschooling is the gold standard, or it should be, for parents who want to have the maximum impact in the lives of their kids. And my guest today is a friend of mine, Jim Mason, who is the founder, I'm going to say it again. My guest today, Jim Mason, is the president of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And I invited him to come on because I have been seeing and talking about it a little bit on the show from time to time, some attacks leveled against homeschooling. And I believe these attacks are coming from people who do not value the freedom that homeschooling gives to parents to determine the upbringing and the education of their children. Before we get going today, I want to say a big thank you to the sponsor of our show. Tuvu is sponsoring the series here at the Heidi St. John podcast. And social media today is very frustrating for a lot of us. We're really sick of the ads, really sick of seeing things in our feed that we didn't want to see because of algorithms. And we're also really tired of having our information sold to advertisers. Tuvu is never going to do that. They are a social media company that cares about you. You guys can find out more by going to tuvu.com/Heidi and get your first month free. Be sure when you get over there, you follow me. And so check it out, tuvu.com/Heidi. So Jim Mason, my friend, good to see you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, it's my pleasure to be on the show with you today.
I'm always intrigued by the work that the Homeschool Legal Defense Association does. You guys been at the forefront of securing and fighting for homeschool freedom in the United States now for well over 40 years. And I think there's a lot of false assumptions now in the homeschool movement that homeschooling is never going to be challenged again, and we can always just assume that our freedoms have been secured and that's the end of that. But we're starting to see some really interesting challenges come to the homeschool movement, probably even more so after COVID, because of the massive amount of people that are checking out homeschooling and deciding not only do we like it, but we want to stick with it. So I'm hoping today that you can just kind of bring us up to speed, a little bit of the history of homeschooling. Obviously, you serve as the president of HSLDA and are doing just a fantastic job over there. But bring us up to speed a little bit. And there are a lot of people, you and I were talking about a few minutes ago, before I realized I was screwing up our recording, that a lot of people don't understand the history, really, of home education in the United States. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah, well, thanks, Heidi. So the important thing to remember is right now, homeschooling is freer in America than it's ever been. But that isn't a foregone conclusion, and it hasn't always been that way. So back when our organization was founded in 1983, people were actually going to jail for the simple act of homeschooling without a teaching certificate. So for the next number of years, there were really big and significant legal and legislative battles just to win the bare right for parents to direct the education of their children through home education. And then another season came along where it became kind of a normal, it moved from fringe and became more of a normal thing. And the battle became Well, some of those old fashioned regulations really didn't help children or parents, achieve good educational outcomes. And so the government's interest wasn't really being served by kind of these antiquated regulations. So for the next season, homeschoolers all across the country, state leaders, HSLDA worked to modernize a lot of the homeschool statutes to where they really do serve families better. There's still a few outlier states, but for the most part, homeschooling in America is really free. There are laws in all 50 states, so I don't want to give the wrong impression. You still have to do certain things to comply with the law. But if you want to homeschool and you're willing to make the sacrifice all across the country, it's available. And along that same lines, the resources to homeschool exploded when a lot of the early homeschoolers began. There just were very few resources. And the other thing to remember is that homeschooling is more than just an educational choice. It's a way that people form new communities. One of the benchmarks or hallmarks of homeschooling in America today is the way that people form associations to help meet the needs of their children and their family and their communities in ways that are not dictated by the government. These are people banding together for a common cause to do what they think is best for their own kids. And a lot of people homeschool for reasons of faith or for the ability to transmit their worldview and values and their religious faith to their children in the next generation. And that's what it kind of brings me to today. Right before COVID, you will remember just about the time the world shut down, a Harvard professor named Elizabeth Bartholet released that's right. She released a law review article. The law review article had actually been posted online in draft form for several months. But in April of 2020, Harvard Magazine profiled Professor Bartholet and this law review article in which she called for a ban of homeschooling in America for reasons that, in her view, which is a worldview, not really evidence-based, but a worldview, that allowing parents to educate their own children was a disservice, maybe even abusive to children. And she wanted to ban homeschooling in all but the tiniest number of cases because of that reason, that it was a clash of worldviews. Well, no sooner did her article get publicized by Harvard Magazine than public schools all across America closed down because of COVID, and suddenly the whole world was homeschooling. So her article kind of lost a lot of traction and purchase. But as you know, and many of our listeners will know, after COVID, a lot of people during COVID discovered, hey, wait a minute, this is kind of nice being home with my kids. A lot of people were working remotely and continued working remotely. They liked the slowed down lifestyle. A lot of hyper achieving families, realized that their world began really early in the morning, rush off to school, after school activities, and you hardly saw your kids at all. And a lot of people, suddenly realized that this is kind of nice. We spend time with our family. We're able to form deeper relationships, and the education stuff is pretty good too. It's working well for our kids. So post-COVID, public schools reopened, and articles all over the country are talking about the public schools are hurting because a lot of kids didn't come back to the public schools. What happened? Well, a lot of them are homeschooling, and new kinds of education kind of cropped up, micro schools and pods and things like that, new varieties of private education. Well, after a little while, when the public schools reopened, mainstream kind of media, like the Washington Post or Amazon Prime, started portraying homeschooling in these, highly polished kind of publications in a negative light. And that continues through today. And it's fundamentally based on a worldview that doesn't agree with families having the freedom that we have come to enjoy. So even, most recently, Scientific American, of all things, Scientific American magazine wrote an article calling for the federal regulation of homeschooling because they're worried that religious parents aren't teaching all of the things that Scientific American thinks should be taught to kids, or they're worried that parents having too much control of their child's education is going to lead to bad consequences, which is just not.
Yeah, like free thinking and possibly not grow up believing in transgenderism and that you could be a narwhal whale if you want to be. But yeah, carry on.
Well, that's one of the things that we're really focusing on. Freedom-loving people have to always be vigilant because pendulums, they swing one way, but then they swing back the other way. And we live in you may have noticed this, but we live in kind of turbulent times and polarized times. And, the freedom that we have fought for, my generation, I actually, I benefited from the work of the early homeschoolers where, my family's been able to kind of homeschool in relative, freedom without too much interference.
Yeah, you didn't really think about it.
Didn't really think about it. But in my job, for the last over 20 years, I see all of the little things that happen, to families, whenever you have kind of an ongoing relationship with government agencies, there's always opportunities for strife, and it's often caused by overreach of the government authorities. And, the big battles to kind of roll away the illegality of homeschooling have been over for a while. I mean, but there's a lot of ideological opposition to the freedom to homeschool that is starting to get traction in the media, and because of that, in legislators around the country who share those ideological views.
Well, and what you've pointed out several times, and I've heard you speak over the years, is that the homeschool movement is a freedom movement. And we're watching, really relatively new, generationally speaking, relatively new leadership in the country. A lot of these guys lean socialist. They're not even quiet about it. You got the Bernie Sanders of the world, and now we've got Kamala Harris running for president of the United States. I just heard her recently talk about how she could, as the Attorney General of California, with the swipe of her pen, take a patent away from somebody who was ideologically opposed to her ideals. These people are really big government people, and we're seeing now legislative action happening to roll back homeschool freedom across the United States. You pointed out in an article that you sent out a couple of days ago, this is happening in Illinois, Michigan, and West Virginia, in part, as you just pointed out, because of negative portrayals in the press. And so we're seeing this sort of pushback against homeschool freedom by people who really do believe that that children are not inherently the responsibility of their parents. They are the responsibility, and they belong to. In fact, we've heard people say this, I think at the College of William and Mary, that they should be really protected by and overseen by the state. This is relatively new ideology coming out of these institutions.
Yeah, so you're referring to Professor Dwyer from William and Mary University, and
yes,
he's pretty forthright about his views. He wrote a book along with another fellow, and he's pretty forthright that he kind of comes from the a statist sort of viewpoint regarding the rearing of children, and that is kind of contrary to traditional American thought down through the generations, but the growth of the state, the growth of the welfare state, the desire of people to boss other people around and seize power to do that is kind of rising, and that is something that we I think really need to pay attention to. And I don't want to raise false alarms because it's fabulous in America right now to homeschool. It's really good, and there's lots of innovative things happening. And you're in the middle of one of the major kind of innovations that that homeschooling families have developed over the years, and that's a great thing. But I can't ignore what I see with my own two eyes And I can't predict what's going to come down the future, other than there are still ideological opponents who would take us back to the days of old if they could.
You wrote that if you get 2 examples of something happening, that's interesting, but 3 examples are a trend. And you said that off the top of your head, you could name 6 examples that are giving evidence of a growing trend that portray homeschooling in a negative light. What are some of those examples?
Well, the first one, which was was the Elizabeth Bartholet law review article, where she was really forthright, and she called for an outright ban.
Wasn't the title of her article like whatever, the downside or the risks of homeschooling? I can't remember it off the top of my head.
The title of the article, I can't recall.
I think it's the risks of homeschooling.
Well,
I mean, that's pretty scary. That sounds like, ooh,
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bartholet. Yes.
Well, and so because it is an ideological battle, she sort of built a straw man, and she portrays people like me and you, advocates for homeschool freedom, as parental rights absolutists. And she would say that we would not recognize the role of the state in the lives of families at all. And that's just not true.
Right.
And we pointed out, so at the time, when we were all here learning how to work remotely, I decamped to some relatives of mine had a house in the Outer Banks in North Carolina, and my family decamped for a month to the Outer Banks, and I learned how to write at the beach, sort of.
Nice.
And we wrote a series of rebuttals, and one of the main rebuttals is, look, we don't think that parents have absolute rights. We think that parental rights are fundamental, meaning they're of the highest order, meaning that the government should only intrude on them for the most important reasons, not just ideological differences. And she was probably the most forthright in calling for a ban of homeschooling, and she was kind of the most forthright, and maybe egregiously so, in stereotyping. I mean, you travel the country, you speak at homeschool conferences, you deal with homeschool families every day. Mm-hmm. It's a diverse bunch.
Absolutely true.
It's people homeschool for a variety of reasons all over the country, in cities, in the country, out of necessity, out of painful experiences, out of religious motivation, all kinds of reasons, all kinds of people. And she would stereotype, she doesn't quite say this, but this is a pretty close to a quote, that most homeschoolers are fundamentalist and backwards, religious zealots.
Yeah, the shiny, happy people type.
Yeah, and so that was,
Yeah.
and that's another example of the focus, the negative focus on homeschooling families, the Prime docuseries, which ended up being the most popular docuseries ever released on Prime, kind of highlighting a years-old scandal. I mean, many years old, and I guess. And it was very popular, involving the scandals of the Duggar family and Bill Gothard, and so we should acknowledge that. I mean, homeschoolers. This may surprise you, but homeschoolers are people.
What? Stop it.
and I would never argue that homeschoolers are without flaw, but the media attention is sort of hyping the flaws but today, this is the interesting thing. Bartholet came out with her really arch negative portrayal right before COVID. Then homeschooling became the oasis for everyone. And lots of people discovered the joys of homeschooling during that time who would never have tried it otherwise.
Right.
And so during that 2 years, homeschooling was portrayed in a very positive light because it was the place where
it was the antidote.
Right. It was the sanctuary during those years. But then post-COVID, the negative portrayals kind of picked up where Bartholet left off, and I would argue they did a better job of it because they're not so stark in their portrayal. She built straw men that were easily sort of challenged, and her prejudices and stereotypes kind of
exposed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the happy, shiny people was one example. The Washington Post
Yes.
Yeah, the Washington Post devoted 2 investigative reporters. I mean, this is in a season when newspapers are going out of business, in a season when all kinds of super duper, world-changing events are happening all the time, all over the world. They devoted 2 investigative reporters to a 6-part series called Homeschool Nation, and all but one of them was kind of a what they would call an expose of
a hit piece,
the dark side of homeschooling kind of thing. Now, the good thing about that is I was interviewed and I got my picture in the Washington Post.
Excellent.
Yeah, how about that?
Who doesn't want their picture in the Washington Post, Jim? Who doesn't want that?
It's a bucket list checkoff, right?
Now you can frame it and be done.
So he came down to our office, and these are real journalists doing really good journalism in the sense of putting together a really slick package. But like I say, I think 5 of the 6 articles had this ideological slant that kind of to you and I would shine through, but I think it's pretty obvious to everyone else as well. Then I mentioned Scientific American was, what in the world? Why is Scientific American writing an article calling for the federal regulation of homeschooling? I mean, it didn't cite any evidence. It just cited these notions that homeschooled children are not being properly cared for. Joel Oliver, which is a thing, I guess, and on HBO did a quasi-comedic takedown of homeschooling. It's just, so...
HBO, that bastion of freedom.
Yes. So
those guys are down for it. I love that you quoted Matthew Hennessy from the Wall Street Journal, noting that this was happening in the media. And he was quoted as saying, "The knives are out for homeschooling." How else to interpret the sudden spat of critical articles referring to the Washington Post series? And he said, "Somebody somewhere has decided this experiment in liberty has gone on long enough." It's almost as if people are starting to go, oh, hey, the homeschool movement is a freedom movement, and we can't have that because they want their control. And we know that education is powerful. It's a powerful tool. If people don't believe that, all they got to do is listen in to the National Education Association's, annual brouhaha in which their commander in chief was seen screaming and yelling and jumping up and down about, and I quote, all the things, and saying that that's what education was about. So to me, seeing Amazon Prime or watching HBO, the Washington Post, Scientific American, which I did an entire podcast just dedicated to the dingbats at Scientific American. And I think it's interesting to note that this is happening at a time when there are more people homeschooling than ever before, but there are a lot of them who don't understand the history of homeschooling and how hard fought the battles for homeschool liberty have been in this country. And I'm wondering, Jim, if you think it's important, again, that as homeschoolers, we keep our history in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's not that long ago, but we do live in this place called America where, yesterday is a long time ago.
Yeah, especially in the news cycle.
That's right.
Yeah.
I cannot keep up with the news cycle.
No, you
honestly.
cannot. No.
But so one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to when I'm driving is called The Rest is History. And I just finished World War I, or the lead up to World War I. And there was so much that, I consider myself to be kind of, well educated. I have a college degree in everything, and I studied history. And there was a lot about the lead up to World War I that
you didn't ever hear about.
I had never heard before. I mean, I never really, paid a whole lot of it. I mean, World War I, it's a long time ago.
I mean, it is.
100 years ago.
And I mean, think about how long ago the founding of our country was. I mean, that was, gazillions of years ago, and dinosaurs roamed the earth.
But that is sort of a problem because, homeschooling kind of started rising in the late 1970s when a lot of families who are today considering or actually homeschooling, the parents weren't even born. and a lot has happened. And when you're born into, or when a thing is easy to do for you, it's not as easy to think that it could change or that it came out of a difficult time. And so, because of my vocation and my wife and I began homeschooling before I went to law school, and I went to law school because I wanted to get involved in this work. And I came here, 22 years ago. Been involved in some really big issues and cases over the years. And, we really should rejoice that a lot of that is kind of behind us for now. Mm-hmm. But without understanding that what you call the freedom movement, it's both a freedom movement, but there's more to it. There was this organic building of a new kind of society that isn't dependent upon or at the beck and call of the government. So if you really go back, over 100 years ago plus, maybe 120 years ago, the first progressive movement the first historical progressive movement in this country, first kind of seized control of education for the state. But before that, education was a private matter, and it was left to families and charities and so during the first...
And they did a pretty good job, Jim. I mean, you could argue the Federalist Papers came out of that era,
right?
Correct?
Well, so Milton Friedman, in his book, Free to Choose, which came out in the early 80s, recounts that, and he says that before the first progressive movement, if you discount slaves, Americans were more literate than they were after the state seized control of education. So the state seizure of education that began, just around 100 years ago has not been a great success. And what homeschoolers did, not necessarily completely by design, but returned to that pre-progressive era seizure of education by the state and returned it to families, churches, and communities. And it's been, the worst that people can say about the educational success of homeschooling. It's, about the same as the public schools. Nobody can say that the educational outcomes are worse than what's happening in the public schools. There's just no evidence for that. There's plenty of evidence that it's very successful for a lot of folks. And so this new organic kind of association that divested itself from state controls is a really interesting movement of the 20th and 21st century that it's kind of phenomenal. That just doesn't happen. It's one of the most successful movements of, it is probably the single most positive, successful movement of my lifetime. And that is a thing to marvel at and to cherish and to preserve. And so what you've said, and I can't agree with you more, is that families today need to get a taste of that, need to kind of have an understanding for that what's good for your family, is worth preserving and protecting.
And that really is the work that HSLDA is engaged in and has been since its founding. I had Alex Newman on my show. Well, he's been on several times. So we've done a lot of conversing about the history of the public schools, and people need to understand the history of the public schools and sort of why they were founded. And it's interesting to note that there are so many of early American schooling was really dominated by home education. And so we had this vibrant free market society. Now we're seeing a move away from the free market, the principles of the free market. And outside of education at home, which was where most children learned, to read and write, the landscape really featured schools that were run by churches and entrepreneurs and, many of America's founding fathers, George Washington, James Madison, Andrew Jackson. These guys, they received at least partially their education at home. And we didn't do such a bad job. Even poor children were educated largely by churches and in parochial institutions. The Quakers, for example, they welcomed everyone. And they thought, hey, children should be educated, whether they can pay for it or not. So really this idea of government-funded, tax-funded K-12 schools as they exist today would have been absolutely unthinkable by early Americans. And yet here we are And I wonder, we're going back. I love this. And I was trying to find the quote, and I think I just found it. Alex Newman said this. He said, long before government seized control over education, Americans were incredibly well educated. Literacy data and vast amounts of anecdotal evidence from that era show that literacy levels were significantly higher in the mid to late 1700s than they are today. Modern studies on the subject confirm it. And then everything changed when we saw people who really were socialists, right, who had this sort of utopian idea of taking over the education of children. And they believed that the government should be in charge of educating children, not parents. Lots of really hardcore socialist ideals and ideologies went into the formation of the government schools. We know them today, really headed off by a guy named Horace Mann, which we don't have time to go into all that history. But it goes back to the point that we were making earlier, which is that the homeschool movement is a freedom movement. It is stating that parents, not the government, should be the ones who direct the education of their children. You know this because you've homeschooled your kids. Homeschooling doesn't mean that we do everything ourselves. It means that we know who's doing it and we choose who's doing it. So like, for example, I will not be teaching algebra to one more child. I am done. And so when Sailor takes algebra, which she's doing this year, guess what? I have a friend who's tutoring her, and thus saving our relationship and possibly my sanity. And so I'm a homeschool mom who's saying, I'm not going to teach Sailor algebra. I'm going to have someone else do that. So it doesn't mean that we're taking every single subject on and doing everything, but it puts parents in the driver's seat of how their children will be educated and who is educating them and when and where. And really, that's kind of what this push that we're seeing against homeschooling, it's coming from it, right? I mean, to me, it's butting up against that and saying, oh, no, mom and dad, sit down, shut up, put a mask on, bleat like a sheep, whatever, and we're going to do it for you. When the vast amount of evidence that's out now shows exactly what you said, which is homeschool parents are actually doing fine. Are there cases of abuse in homeschooling? Yes. There are abusive people in every sphere of influence, right? In public schools, in private schools. I grew up in a Christian school, K through 12, and I came from an abusive home. So I can tell you that these situations are happening in every sphere of education. But the reaction against it that we're seeing recently, I think, is alarming. And it's enough for organizations like HSLDA. I think people need to give another look at why they should be members of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association and the work that you guys are continuing to do to not only secure homeschool freedom, but to stand guard. You guys are the watchmen on the wall for homeschool freedom from sea to shining sea. And you've had a tremendous impact in the battle to maintain the freedom that we now enjoy. Tell us a little bit about what HSLDA is doing. You mentioned in your article, and I'd love it if you could just comment on some of this stuff, because when I say, oh, we're seeing, some challenges to homeschooling that are happening in the state of Illinois, places like that, people kind of roll their eyes and go, oh, that's not really happening, but it is happening. And maybe you can comment on some of these challenges that are coming out of some of these states. Did we say West Virginia? Was that one of them? Maybe a little bit about what's going on and what HSLDA's role is in those cases.
Yeah, so some of these high-profile stories attract the attention of legislators. Let me just go back. You mentioned child abuse as being kind of a lot of the stories are profiling high, really horrible cases of
that's
child
true.
abuse. Just last week, I interviewed Danny Shaquille, who's a researcher, and he and Brian Ray of the National Home Education Research Institute, and Danny's with the university in England, in Buckingham. And they did a study, and it was a very comprehensive study. It was a quantitative study, not a qualitative study. And
explain the difference.
So a qualitative study is when you kind of do interviews and focus groups and you get people's stories. And a quantitative study is when you get a set of data and you analyze the data. And so they got a data set and they did a survey of adults who had been homeschooled. And the question was, both homeschooled and public school. And the question was, they were trying to tickle out, are homeschooled children more likely to be abused than other children? And their conclusion was, no, it's not. There are so many other factors, demographic factors, and families are very complicated. And when you control for all of the demographic factors, it's no more prevalent amongst homeschool kids than anywhere else. I mean, it's all these other things. And so, but what happens, and this is a dilemma for us who are practitioners and advocates, a high-profile case pulls at your heartstrings. It's horrible. You want to be able to fix it, right? You want to be able to do something that will prevent it. But if you begin with the proposition that human nature is, a constant and people are flawed, you can't fix it. You can't prevent it. They're at the margins, maybe. But what happens then in a high-profile case, along the lines of, those who have a worldview that don't want homeschooling to continue as it is, take a high-profile case, highlight it, that gets the attention of a legislator, and the legislator just wants to do right by kids. That's their motivation. They don't really understand all the things that we've talked about, how, what really happens in the public education system, and how homeschooling is such a positive thing in the lives of many millions of children over all these years. They don't know that. They don't get it. What they know is that there's this one story, and I want to fix it.
Right.
And so that's what a nonprofit media organization called ProPublica, which is funded by tens of millions of dollars, and kind of coming from the political left, the ideological, more state control crowd, highlighted a story, and a legislator took it up and is saying, going to introduce legislation. And the kind of legislation that they want to introduce.
This is in Illinois, correct?
Yes, in Illinois. The kind of legislation that they want to introduce is like, mandatory homeschool families bringing their kids into a social services officer to be inspected, periodically, that kind of thing. Yeah. So it's a real intrusion on the lives of millions and millions and millions of families where it's not needed. And it won't, those isolated, rare occasions, you can't find them. You can't prevent them. They happen. They happen, in public schools and in private schools, as you mentioned. So that's just one example.
Yeah. And I wonder, we're seeing this pushback now against homeschooling. I thought it was interesting that they sort of weighed in and claimed that too much homeschool liberty is a bad thing, which kind of tells me that they have a disdain for liberty as it relates to parental rights and freedom for parents to determine the upbringing of their children. I mentioned earlier that I came from actually a very bad situation in a private Christian school. This went on the entire time that I was there, from kindergarten through 12th grade. But the solution to my suffering was not to shut the school down. The solution to what was happening in my family wasn't to penalize the school for it. And back then, people just sort of understood that. I think it's interesting that they're taking aim at homeschooling when they find a child who's being abused, whose parent happens to be operating under the guise of home education. To me, that's just sort of it has more to do with getting to the fabric of home education, which is that it's a freedom movement, and sort of chipping away at that, than really getting to help that family that obviously is struggling. And maybe they're just, you've got wickedness, you've got mental illness. There's a million different factors that go into an abusive situation. But to blame the education of the child on that is misguided at best and dangerous at worst. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Right. And so, yeah, to fix, it's a problem that is probably very difficult to fix in the first place. Most of the stories that are profiled, the family is well known to the public already, often been investigated by children's services.
Right.
And so it's not like, there are already kind of mechanisms and safety nets and things in play. But it does kind of come out of, there's a genuine desire to help children, but then there's the kind of, I think, a pincer movement post-COVID with I read articles about once a week about public school systems really bemoaning the fact that their coffers are drying up.
They're losing money.
They're losing money. And, if I were a public school administrator and fewer kids were coming and that meant fewer dollars and you're shutting down public schools, they're doing a lot of things to, attract people back to the public school. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is there is a strong ideological opposition to the notion that parents should be free in the way that we are today.
Yeah.
And those two things together, they're making common cause now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And you guys are really, as I said before, and we've got about 2.5 minutes left in the show, and I really want to highlight the work that HSLDA is doing and explain why membership to HSLDA is such a good idea.
Yeah, so we monitor the federal government as well as every state legislature every year for legislation that could be harmful to homeschool freedom. We have tens of thousands of member families that I view them as my early warning society. You'd be surprised how many times a local school district will, some new official will come in and say, "Hey, this isn't good enough. This
right, we need this.
This homeschool law is not adequate," and they try to enforce some new standard that's outside of their authority to do. And we help thousands and thousands of families every year navigate those kinds of things, as well as a big thing that we're really interested and involved in is, when homeschooled kids graduate. This is becoming kind of in the rear view too, but homeschool diplomas were not always treated as a successful completion of high school for college admission or military admission or becoming a sheriff's deputy or all manner of adult things that well-educated, well-socialized, good citizen homeschool graduates should be, and they are often sought after. But there are certain institutions, so we work to prevent that kind of thing on behalf of adults who had been homeschooled. And we're just, like you said, we are the freedom watchdog. And so we keep our eyes and ears open, and our radar, is pretty sensitive to threats to freedom.
If someone wanted to become a member of HSLDA, obviously, I've been involved in the work and the movement in partnership with HSLDA for a very long time. What happens when someone becomes a member of HSLDA? What would be the reason for them to do that?
So we have we are in one sense a boutique law firm that handles homeschool-related issues, and our members have 24/7 access to our attorneys. If you have a homeschool-related issue that's kind of a routine issue, you can call us during business hours. If you have an emergency issue, we have an answering service, and you'll get to an attorney 24/7 to handle that, to help you navigate that question right at the moment.
So if CPS, for example, and this is not, necessarily as uncommon as people might think it is, if CPS comes to your door and says, "Hey, we had a complaint, we need to come into your house," and that's a homeschool family, they can pick up the phone and get some direction with how to handle that, right?
Absolutely. One of my favorite after-hours calls came from Tanya Acevedo in New York City, and she had just withdrawn her child to homeschool. And the public school continued to record her child as absent, even though she completely followed the law.
Interesting. Okay.
And so their the way they handle things in New York is they send a CPS investigator to the house after so many absences. So that's what happened. She had a CPS investigator at her apartment in New York City, called me at 7 o'clock at night, and I helped her navigate that, got that investigation closed successfully. And then we sued New York City because of that practice. This is fairly recent. We actually got a consent decree from New York City on behalf of the whole city that New York City would revise how it handles that kind of situation. It was their fault that the investigator was there.
Yeah.
And
terrifying this woman.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so for 2 years, New York City had to report their compliance with the consent decree to us.
Oh, well, that's kind of that was a little cherry on top.
Yeah.
I love it. I think, people can find out more by going to hslda.org. And I've always said, one of my favorite things about the website at HSLDA is that you can click on your state, find out your state law, look for state support groups. I'm a huge fan, as everyone who listens to this show knows. I don't think that you need to homeschool your kids in isolation. I think we were created for relationship. We need each other. Forming these communities is very important. It's why my husband and I have started over 100 homeschool cooperatives around the United States, and now Firmly Planted Family is flourishing here in the Pacific Northwest. And you guys can find out information about what's going on locally simply by going to hslda.org and clicking on your state. It's a fantastic organization with a wonderful website with a heart to serve the homeschool community and safeguard your freedom. And Jim Mason is leading the charge. Jim, it's just been a delight to have you on the show today. Thank you for coming on. Let's do it again.
Well, thank you, Heidi, and thank you for your work in the homeschooling world and being, I don't know if you mentioned this, but you serve on our board.
Absolutely. It's an honor. Yeah, it's an honor to do that. So thank you, Jim, for coming on. I will see you in September in Nashville. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
A closing thank you to the sponsor of this show, Tuvu. Tuvu is a wholesome social media company that connects people, families, and communities. Join Tuvu today and experience social media that truly cares about you. Go to tuvu.com/Heidi and check it out today. That's tuvu.com/Heidi.